Recording in progress.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Chester County History Center. My name is Ellen Enslow, and I'm the Director of Collections and Curator here at the History Center. And it was my privilege to reach out to the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service a couple of years ago to see what was in their catalog of offerings, and this exhibit was there. And the price was right. Thanks to the underwriting of a major foundation and individual donors, they deliberately made this exhibit as accessible as possible to institutions throughout the United States for free. Nice. The thing is, though, we had to apply for it. And thanks to decades of trying to do programming that is inclusive and diverse, I was able to make the case that the History Center was a great place for this institution. So we are delighted to be the host of it. We are the only Pennsylvania host of this show, and it closes this coming Saturday. We were fortunate to have a 4-month run instead of the original 1 month, and we're grateful for that. It will be continuing to travel throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast section of the country before it finally closes in a year or so. And one of the things that we had to do that was part of the contract, and no problem from our perspective, was to do at least two programs that related to bias in some way. And we had a bias program about disability in December, and we were thrilled to have unfortunately, we're not thrilled about the bias, but we are glad to have a program about bias to shed light on it for the medical perspective on the topic. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Guman, who is going to be the moderator for this evening's conversation. And then she will introduce the two speakers who are specialists in different ways on the topic. So Elizabeth Guman conducts strategic planning, designs and facilitates leadership development programs, and consults on nonprofit issues, including board development, partnerships, and mergers. She has helped guide numerous collective impact and cross-sector collaboratives, both in Philadelphia and nationally. In her extensive collective impact work, Elizabeth strategically supports initiatives in integrating equity as part of their framework to specifically reduce racial disparities. In addition, Elizabeth has led clients, other B Corps, and other groups she is connected to in actively unlearning white fragility while practicing anti-oppressive strategies and allyship to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Elizabeth?
Thank you. Logistically, I want to say that we cannot use a microphone because we have our online folks and the microphone doesn't work with that. So we are all going to project. Jen is going to help me in the back if we start to get soft, but please, you do the same. If you're not hearing us, please raise your hand and we will get louder. Generally, I can be loud, but I get tired at night, so you never know, I might start fading. I also want to say that I am here as a substitute for my amazing colleague, Deanna Gonzalez, who was slated to be our panelist, our moderator tonight, and is home with the flu, but joining us online. So, hey, Deanna. Deanna and I work together at Strategy Arts, and Deanna leads our equity work. But I have all her notes, so hopefully I'll do her proud. So I'm going to just do a little bit to set the stage, and then I'm going to set things over to our panelists. So a couple guidelines I wanted to share as we get started tonight. And the first one is that we want to approach this, and we want to encourage you to approach this as learners. Our coming in approach is that all of us have bias inside of us. That's the nature of the principle behind the exhibit. And so what can we learn tonight that helps us uncover a bit more about the bias inside of us? So I encourage you to come to that as a goal, and that will be certainly how I'm approaching this. pausing and expanding with discomfort. So one of the things that will happen is as we encounter bias, we will oftentimes have actually physically be uncomfortable. And so I encourage you to notice that for yourself and let that, like, try and hold yourself in that space and let yourself be let that be a learning opportunity for you. At the same time, I want to say that we want to encourage you to take care of yourselves. So in this presentation, there might be content that is actually activating for some of you because it connects to personal experience. And so please notice that. Please feel free to step out or step away, or for those of you online to go, to step away from the computer for a bit. So we want to encourage that as well. The engaging the audience, the way we're going to move through the content tonight is that we are going to have each of our presenters present some content to us. After each person goes, then we will spend a few moments in taking some questions from those of you in the audience, both in person as well as online. Then we'll have our second speaker, we'll do the same thing. And then I have some general questions for the panel that we'll do in our last section together. So be ready with any questions that you might have, and Jen is gonna field questions from our online audience as well. And then lastly, take up space and leave space. So we ask you to, if you have a question, to feel free to ask it, but also to leave some space for others to do the same. Tonight, we're going to learn from our esteemed panelists about the history of science and how bias informed a dark legacy in science. And we'll also learn how those legacies have an impact even today. And that's kind of the design of our two panelists. It's essential as we gather tonight that we all approach this as learners. And some of the information you hear tonight may not be new information, but there's always new perspectives. So it's important to note that as individuals actively evaluating our bias, the work is continuous and actually a lifelong journey. So let's see. We have a guiding quote. Oh, wanted to ground us with two definitions. The first one is on bias. And this definition comes from says that bias is defined as a preference or prejudice, either for or against another thing, person, or group. And then our definition around science comes from the Science Council. Science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and actual world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So that's what we're going to be examining tonight, is both the bias and how it shows up in science and how it impacts us today. I have a quote to ground us with from W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a guiding quote that actually Deanna shared with us. For those of you that don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African-American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard and co-founder of the NAACP. Du Bois was a social science artist, historian, philosopher, journalist, novelist, and poet. And his quote is that the world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil was stupidity, and the cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation. As a data scientist, Du Bois was hired by the University of Pennsylvania in 1895, and he moved to Philadelphia. He published his groundbreaking book, The Philadelphia Negro, and it's one of the earliest examples of sociology that's just as a statistically based social science. So using his quote felt like a good grounding moment for us. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Our time together will start with Dr. Brent Ruswick, followed by Dr. Tiffany Cook. So introducing Dr. Ruswick. Dr. Ruswick was trained as a historian of medicine and science. He is a Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin. He is the author of one book called Almost Worthy: The Poor, Paupers, and Science of Charity in America. He's the editor and contributor to a just released anthology. So for you readers, we've got some good stuff for you. That one's called The Cultural History of Poverty in the Age of Empire, and co-author of a digital textbook in American history and several historical and pedagogical articles. After we hear from Dr. Ruswick, we will hear from Dr. Tiffany Cook. Dr. Cook is the Director of Health Equity at the Penn Medicine Chester County Hospital, where she leads initiatives to advance equitable care, reduce disparities, strengthen patient-centered practices. She's a pediatrician with 15 years of clinical experience and more than 7 years in process and quality improvement. Dr. Cook specializes in systems level change, community engagement, and culturally responsive care. She also holds an MBA, Masters of Urban Bioethics, and a certification as a breastfeeding counselor. So we've got great folks to speak with us tonight, and we're going to start with Dr. Ruswick.
My haircut's about 5 years, about 3 or 4 shavings put off to go. Give me another week or so, and I'll be back to that. I want to offer several thank yous before I begin to my dear friends and colleagues, Jennifer and Ellen, for inviting me, to Elizabeth for stepping in, and for guidelines that closely resemble my own class guidelines, to Dr. Cook for giving me a chance to learn from you, and my wife for allowing me to miss dinner and bedtime with our preschoolers, which doesn't happen too often. Let me begin by seeing if we should get this to advance. Maybe. Okay, there we go. Let me begin by maybe offering a few of the aha moments that come from, okay. We'll begin by offering a few aha moments from the classes that I teach at Westchester on the history of science and medicine and the relationship to bias. I begin by sort of cautioning students to not be too hurried to give too neat and tidy of a definition of science, or to be too hurried to dismiss the past as those stupid ages, to not be in too much of a hurry to explain away scientific dead ends as failures to follow some eternal, timeless definition of science that would have made us all bias free. Instead, it turns out that science is not so easily defined. And what it looks like, what it means, is varied from place to place and from time to time. We should appreciate that science can only be done by people, and those people exist in contexts that mean they can only do science with the tools that are available to them. We could catalog all the ways that somebody from 1500 or 1900 failed to anticipate what we now believe to be correct. But I think that our time would probably be better spent appreciating that a person can only see the world that they are prepared to see. And so we shouldn't be that surprised that a scientist from 1700, even when employing the best scientific tools of their day, is still going to think like somebody from the 1700s and have that be reflected in their science. Taking a historical perspective doesn't stop us from criticizing those people in the past for their failings, but it maybe lets us begin from a place of greater historical empathy and modesty and humility about our own selves. In other words, science is a social activity, therefore it is done by flawed people in flawed societies, and our feet always are made of clay. I've always enjoyed the sort of odd painting here of a revolutionary technology. Today, an air pump to create some of the first vacuums was crucial in discovering the principal components of the atmosphere, and was great entertainment for families to watch suffocating birds for scientific edification. Related to that, I don't want you to get me wrong, science works extraordinarily well. It works because we have a multiplicity of scientific methods designed to winnow out bad data and bad interpretations in a way that, frankly, is elitist, that there are indeed better methods that lead to better claims of fact, that do a better job of meeting up with observed reality, that it sort of establishes that my opinion is not as good as your peer-reviewed meta-analysis. But it also has the potential, at least in theory, to be small d democratic and inclusive, that you could follow Francis Bacon or Rene Descartes' scientific methods from the scientific revolution. They pretty explicitly say that these methods are open to anyone and everyone. We're all capable of generating observations and coming together in consensus. This is from the Royal Society, which is royal, and therefore quite elitist, but based upon that principle of, at least in theory, inclusive access to these methods that get you to the truth. So here's what I think is maybe a kind of central conundrum when we talk about bias in science and scientific authority today. On the one hand, many of us give scientists great deference and great authority because their methods are good. They are ways to approach an objective understanding of the world. It can land us on the moon, cure diseases, make us smarter and healthier and stronger and wealthier. But it is that exact same claim of give us your trust, give us your money, give us your credibility and authority because we pursue objectivity, not our own personal bias, that then makes it subject potentially to great abuse. It makes it subject to potentially great confusion and controversy when everybody is claiming that they are the unbiased and objective one. For instance, you will note there's a lot of conflict going on right now between our presidential administration and various scientific organizations. Both claim to be representing the values of disinterested, unbiased science. In May, the president signed an executive order to promote what he calls gold standard science and criticize scientific research that he says is based on bad data and bad methods. The Union of Concerned Scientists respond that this sort of gold standard science might itself be a Trojan horse for introducing sources of political bias into scientific research. Or, for a century ago, you had the sort of skull measuring scientists that insist that they had the objective science to prove racial superiority. Did not. The cultural anthropologists and other critics said that all of that was biased and that their anti-racist conclusions were the correct, objective, unbiased ones, which they were. I studied the history of flat earthers, and you'll be amused to learn that they do insist that they are the ones being properly scientifically skeptical and objective. So what is a confused person who is not a scientific expert, including myself, supposed to do? Mercifully, this is a 20-minute talk, and so I do not have to answer that at the time that is left to me. So let's see if we can get forward, moving forward with this. Instead, we're going to try to make the rest of this talk focus on some local examples from Chester County history of sources of bias. If need to, I can sit there and advance one at a time.
We're the History Center. We're not used to this.
If need be, I can sit here. That makes it easier to advance this way. We'll see what happens here. So, trying to put a pin in that question, and want to instead look at a couple of scientists with Chester County roots. And here too, I'm going to try to dangerously sum up maybe a semester's worth of course material by trying to define what the so-called science of eugenics was, and sort of underlying biases. We'll look at a couple of scientists from the area who are proponents of it. You would begin by taking the principles that we sometimes awkwardly and clumsily call social Darwinism, the principles that believe that those supposedly better suited to their environment, the so-called fit, would survive, reproduce, pass on those advantages, and move the species forward to a more highly evolved state of being. And eugenicists, like the two at the center of my talk, then ask, why isn't that actually happening? Why does it seem that the so-called unfit are reproducing more than the supposed so-called fit? That is a diagram that I've spent half of my life on that supposedly shows 6 members of a unfit family, what we would now call colloquially white trash, then give rise to about 7 generations and several thousand individuals who are part of that extended sort of clan of the unfit. Why aren't they dying out? And so eugenicists then propose coercive measures to accomplish what social Darwinism was not accomplishing. You can see those listed, there. And it turns out, there we go, that one of the central figures in eugenic history began his career at the Westchester State Normal School, a mile away from here, Henry Goddard. He was one of the first scientifically trained PhDs in psychology. He was arguably more successful as a football coach. You quit while you're ahead, as you can see there. He doesn't last long at Westchester for conflicts that aren't really material here, but instead he accepts a new position working with children with intellectual disability at Vineland in southern New Jersey. He and his undernoticed, undercredited, underblamed co-researcher and ghostwriter and scientific translator Elizabeth Kite, so underappreciated that I didn't include a photo of her, is also from the area. She's from the Westtown School, a couple miles away, and they create the first intelligence tests. He is famous for introducing the scientific categories, and they were scientific, of moron, imbecile, and idiot to measure all of this. He, and then again, Kite, produced a manifesto that argued that a Revolutionary War soldier, who you see there, fooled around with a supposedly low IQ woman during the war, who then gave birth to a family tree that extended to supposedly hundreds of other sort of low IQ, unfit people, while after the war he settles down with a worthy woman who produces a lineage full of worthy children. Supposedly scientific biological proof of the importance of a woman's heredity, which they use then for to argue for restrictions on reproductive opportunity for women that are judged feeble-minded. For Goddard, the proposal was institutionalization during childbearing years. And an alarming number of eugenicists, this might be one of the main points for me for the evening, are people who, in other areas of their work, we would recognize as the good guys, the progressive social reformers. A lot of our favorite do-gooders found lots to admire in eugenics, which is difficult to sit with. Among the ones that I go to as eugenic curious, eugenic sympathizers are Helen Keller and W.E.B. Du Bois. Awkward. So for Goddard and Kite, for example, their pursuit of the good included trying to better differentiate educational needs for children with intellectual disability, who they believed, in a sharp break from the past, could be educated the same way as any other child could be, just sort of at a different pace. Goddard designed some of the first teacher education courses, what we now call special education. And so on some level, you really couldn't talk about biology or psychology or medicine without sort of being expected to address how those insights are going to build a better world that has less poverty, less crime, less vice in it, by supporting only the birth of the good people, the fit people. And this might be worth keeping in mind, for, later, that just because we see the obvious bias in eugenics today did not make it a fake science or pseudoscience. Then we were talking about people that were fully credentialed in institutions of higher education and knowledge generation, that were engaged in what they were expected to do, address how science is relevant to the society around us. That brings us to our main Westchester eugenicist, as I check on how the time's doing. That would be Samuel Schmucker. And again, he's clearly somebody who is trying to be one of the good guys and was widely seen as such by his peers, who again will note mostly looked like him. Right. He was a biology professor with a profound, if somewhat odd, faith. He was very well rooted in his family, in the Presbyterian and Lutheran churches of this area. When we get our first fundamentalists in the 19 teens and 20s who insist that Christianity and evolution are incompatible, he, already well known as a science popularizer, debates one of them in Philadelphia. That never ends well for the biologist. We can talk about that later if we need. He's more of a popularizer than he is a researcher, and his life's mission is to bring together his faith and his science. And he believes that the story of humanity, as revealed by both evolution and religion, is one of moral progress, and he wants to help. And oh, does he? Here you see one of the first of several books that he writes, popularizing evolution and sort of its religious message called The Study of Nature. That's sort of his book stamp in the middle, an ex libris, where he sort of expresses his belief in the unity of science and religion. The dogwood flower had all sorts of special symbolism for him out of sort of small individual flowers that create sort of a larger cohesive whole, which he found quite meaningful. But then in sort of book after book, when he is done with sort of the principles of science and evolution that you would expect a popularizer to do, he does what was expected of him, frankly, as a scientist, and comments on how that's going to make a better world for the rest of humanity. And he does that by focusing on what was at the time called the feeble-minded. And here we should probably appreciate that that is a very elastic term that would include intellectual disability, also neurodiversity, and also just being a little bit different today. Here we see him expressing his scientific conviction that humanity needs to be free from all of this. That being feeble-minded is in some sense being not fully evolved. On some level, he is saying that such people are subhuman. When they reproduce, he believes that they are, quote, poisoning the human stock. And here again, we see the influence of people we often consider to be the good guys in history, the conservationists and environmentalists of the time, who often also drew from the same pool as the eugenicists. They were each concerned with preservation of the good seed. They were each concerned about protecting environments from invasive species or people in the eugenicists' case. Each was concerned with the idea of pollution and using a lot of the same sort of rhetorical devices. Again, this idea that as a pollution, you attack it at its source by ending reproductive opportunity for anybody that is judged to be feeble-minded. Schmucker, like Goddard, and like most of the eugenic-oriented scientists, does not call for sterilization. And in spite of that, we still have sterilizations done for eugenic motives, depending on how you sort of define it. Somewhere between maybe 68,000 and several 100,000 people sterilized for eugenic motives. But Schmucker is much too proper of a person to be spending his books talking about PG-13 things like sexual organs. And so for him, he calls for basically something several steps beyond what Goddard had called for: sex-segregated institutionalization that is mandatory for all people judged feeble-minded, very elastic term again, for all of their life. And you might note that that would be phenomenally expensive. And so he is going to propose paying for that with the inmates' uncompensated labor to the institution's benefit for the institution's profit and upkeep. And again, that was a rather common proposal for the day. Here you see dock workers loading the docks at an institution in Alaska, selling product made at the institution for the institution's profit without them seeing a cent. Same story for women working in a laundry at an institution that was taking in laundry, institution for people with intellectual disability. And again, he probably got this from his friend Goddard, who has charts indicating what level of IQ person could do what sort of uncompensated work in institutions at the same time. Schmucker does this very much as representative of the Westchester State Normal School. Here he is speaking out in Colorado to a teachers' college, and again, sort of calling for the same sort of scrutiny to human reproduction that we give to livestock. And again, arguing for mandatory lifelong segregation by sex of all people with intellectual disability paid for by their labor to the institution's benefit. A lot of this for the eugenicists was anxiety about the future of the white race. A lot of concern early on was toward the so-called white trash. And if they are out reproducing better class whites, then where does that leave supposed white superiority? And so even when it's not obviously about race and racism, it still is about race and racism, as we see in several of his other writings, where he summarizes some of that we now know incorrect racial scientist about supposed biological differences between races, doing that without summarizing any of the work being done at the same time. That was noting that all of this is complete nonsense. He frankly would have been worse in some of his commentary, but still at the end of the day, he has pretty clear statements about civilization, being something that white people responded to with greater adaptability and greater inventiveness. He talks about this to the local Pennsylvania German Society about how his people, you'll note the Iron Cross that was in his book stamp, that his people are the ones best suited for farming and democracy and science. He would take this belief with him into his science classrooms at Westchester, where, as the student newspaper reports, when he was doing it, he would scan the room for students who best approximated the facial features of the pure Nordic and Alpine and Mediterranean types, and invite them back to his office to be photographed for future use in educational slides on racial type. I teach students how to be teachers. We do not do this under any circumstances. He sort of hems and haws about the biological fitness of mixed race children in theory, while in practice, he claims that it would only be the dregs of races that would engage in interracial sex, and that therefore the children must also be biological dregs. He has similar commentary about women, again, even when it's not about race, it's about race, about how the highest ideal for women needs to be giving birth to eugenically fit kids. So he has all sorts of thoughts about how sort of the modern woman who avoids that responsibility is a sport whose type will likely not last, for long. These writings are admittedly a small fraction of his larger body of work. They were all but forgotten. Really, all of his work was forgotten by the time that Westchester named a science building after him in the 1960s. An alumnus proposed naming it after everybody's favorite science teacher from 40 years ago. The president went, okay, and as far as I can tell, that was the end of the scrutiny of it. Another 50 years goes by, and Schmucker is an entirely forgotten man. By 2020, maybe 5 people on campus could have told you who the science building was named after and why. To wrap up, I have no sense how close I am to 20 minutes with technical lags, but we're wrapping up here. 4 years ago, a student of mine wanted to know about Goddard's influence at the university. And so he started reading through Schmucker's works, the first person in probably 60 years to have done that. I started teaching about what we were finding. A student of mine in another course discovered that newspaper article from Colorado and the Teachers College. At that point, we decided to bring it to the university's attention, follow the chain of command. You see the brick wall that I then have in the background there. So plan B was taking it to the media. In this case, the student media with our very brave student newspaper. And here I will borrow from one of my kids' favorite children's books about how chaos ensued. It all got a little crazy. And we can skip over the sort of details to sort of note that the university eventually correctly concluded that we were not erasing history by changing the building name, that we had discovered a history that had been forgotten because no one knew who the guy was on the building, and that we can recognize that Schmucker, for all of the good that he did in popularizing and teaching, science, always did that inside of a larger package of envisioning a future where many of us were not in it, that it was going to be far more homogenous. And so, concluding slide is that the decisive issues that led to the building's unnaming was reaching a consensus that while Schmucker was a man of his times, we might forgive him some of the biases of his times. There are other scientists who were also people of their times who said this was wrong, who opposed it. Governor Pennypacker in Pennsylvania vetoed eugenic solutions. The people being institutionalized and sterilized quite clearly tell us that they believe it was wrong, and that they too were people of their times. And last remark is that while biologists and scientists today tend to sort of wash their hands of the eugenicists as saying, well, that was fake science and pseudoscience, historians would not be so quick to sort of let the past off the hook. Eugenics clearly existed inside of the boundaries of acceptable scientific practice. It was deeply entrenched in universities across the nation. It was contested and politicized, but that's not the same thing as being a fake science in its day. We would say that science is a distinctly human endeavor, and it's always going to take on the values of the institutions and people in which it is done. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes to field a few questions for Dr. Ruswick before we move to Dr. Cook. Do we have any questions from those of you here? And then we could turn to online. Yes.
Can you stand up, please, so we can hear you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Given that we currently have an administration in Washington that is explicitly anti-science and I take encouragement from the fact that what happened to the creationism after the Scopes trial in the 1920s, which the nominations that really fostered it essentially went underground themselves politics for about 50 years. It really wasn't until Jerry Falwell and the form of majority in the 70s that I'm wondering what suggestions you might have for essentially doing the same thing and relegating this anti-science to
So let me ask Jen, do we need to repeat the question? Yes. Yeah, so let me see if I can summarize the question of what suggestions do you have for how to, I think I heard you say relegate the kind of anti-science current movement that's happening.
I'm a better historian than policy strategist. I've not yet been able to use my history skills to get anybody elected or defeated. I mean, I think that while I do not have a pathway for structural change, across the board, we know from an evidence-based perspective, the expertise which we value, that simply hitting somebody over the head with a ream of scientific evidence is not the path to changing their beliefs. That what tends to happen is they then sort of argue their beliefs back at you in a way that further entrenches and solidifies their beliefs in a you versus me system. And so on an individual level, something unlike what we are doing here, of asking thoughtful questions and asking follow-ups and trying to get people to think more about what they believe and why the implications are, is the path on an individual level out of science denialism or science skepticism. I think that sort of recognizing that people have valid reasons to be leery of science because of that element of elitism, that element of why, in fact, I do have better answers than your opinions, that is disconcerting to people, also needs to be addressed. Science does get used to abuse through that cloak of objectivity.
Thank you. Let's get one more here and then we could do one online if there is one.
I think one of the biggest concerns that I have about our culture today is this term woke. And to me, the etymology of woke is being aware, right? And the implicit bias that the exhibit downstairs is about, what we're talking about today, somehow it's been stigmatized to be aware of that. And so to me, that sort of undermines everything that we stand for as Americans, right? So I wonder if the solution to this is somehow to take this exercise today and to make it writ large, to make woke, to make being aware, awake to bias cool somehow. How do you do that? I mean, like, how do you take the information that you have shared here today and popularize it in a way that connects with so many people across this country who kind of buy into that whole rejection of woke culture? They're good people, but somehow they have been, lured into rejecting awareness of bias.
And again, I'll start with some profession of modesty that I'm not the person who's going to be, the next, breakout pop hit science communicator across, the country. I do think, listening to some of my students, that part of what has happened over the last decade is that well-meaning teachers and authority figures in their life try to teach those values and perspectives as we desire. And at some level, sort of the punk rock, anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian thing to do began to be to sort of embrace ignorance, to embrace anti-science, to embrace bigotry. And so, I mean, the attitude that I try to take into my classrooms, or here, is that, I mean, at the moment, sort of the most punk, anti-establishment, anti-authority thing that you can do is to be just sort of humble and curious, and to listen to other people and want to know more than what you already do. That's, I don't know if that's going to compete with edgelord influencers online or not. It's best answer that I have.
Thank you. Let's get one question from online.
We have one question from online. Megan asked, what sneaky eugenics do you notice in scientific articles or topics in the modern world?
I don't think that I'm in a position to critique any individual scientific paper. I think that where I would caution medical sciences nowadays, and this is taking a page out of several history and sociology of scientists, is not be in too great of a rush to talk about a gene that causes illness or disability as a bad gene. I think that all of us have a tendency, when we are talking about a hereditary illness, to describe that as a bad gene. And I get that. I do not wish hereditary illness on anyone. But it does start to project our cultural values and assumptions onto somebody else's fiber of their being. So I guess I'd leave it at that.
Appreciate it. All right, I'm sure we could continue the conversation, and we will, but let's shift over and give some time to Dr. Cook. This is working now.
Liz? I don't think it's working.
I was holding it. Let's go back here. Oh, seriously.
So maybe, can you maybe, do the.
Yeah.
That's the, and I'll just tell you the tap.
You got it.
Awesome.
Right.
On it.
Now I'll try. Just try on.
Oh. Okay.
You gotta go forward, one. Get to it, yep.
We're going the wrong way.
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. So again, my name is Dr. Tiffany Cook. I am excited to be here. Dr. Ruswick, thank you for that foundation. We're gonna switch gears a little bit. So I'd love to shift our focus on how bias shows up today at the bedside and why it matters. So I'll be presenting understanding implicit bias in clinical medicine, the context, the causes, and care. I have 4 objectives today. So one, I'm going to describe implicit bias. Dr. Ruswick has already described how science and medicine has been used somewhat to justify oppression. I'm going to further that into racism and inequitable care. I'm going to recognize the ways implicit bias may manifest in clinical decision-making, how it can affect how I communicate with my patients, and more importantly, how it affects patient outcomes and health equity. Explain why implicit bias persists in modern clinical environments. A little bit briefly, we'll talk about cognitive processes behind biases and other external factors that can make bias kind of creep in slowly but surely. And then last, we're gonna leave with some hope, some positivity, discuss some strategies to promote individual accountability, and then also discuss the support systems and structural changes that are needed to mitigate bias in patient care. Flip. I have no financial disclosures. There you go, perfect. All right, so we know that health outcomes are largely or only due to 20% of what I do at the bedside. So health outcomes for any of you, 20% of it is due to what the care I give, the medications you give, where you get care at. A large part of your health outcome is going to be due to where you live at, where you play at. It's going to be due to the current laws, policies, and procedures that are in place that affect access and so on. And then on an interpersonal level, it's really going to be focusing on your health-related social needs and also those close social relationships. Despite advances in medicine, we know that health disparities and equity still persist just because of this, the facts that I just said. As a provider, I like to think that I'm very egalitarian. I want to help. I want to do no harm, but I carry within me unconscious biases and associations that does cause harm. So as doctors, we can be drivers of health, but sometimes without realizing it, we're also drivers of disparity. All right. So this picture comes from ASTA and their group with the National Equity Project. And what we're seeing basically, and I love it, is a reinforcing feedback loop. So we're starting with us as humans, and we're all primed. We are receiving messages on a daily basis. We have our social circles. Someone and some things are telling us what is normal, what is valuable, what is desirable. And it's just implanted in us. However, we're the same people making these laws, policies, and practices. So with that, these structures, these systems are created on bias. And what you're going to see is that because of that, the outcomes that we get, disparate outcomes, are going to be biased. Now, what will happen, and medicine is a big culprit in this, we don't, when we teach medical students, the proper context behind why we're seeing what we're seeing. So if I'm a medical student and I'm seeing these poor outcomes, eventually I may associate race and other factors with, hey, you're the cause of the problem, or you are the problem. And we're talking about race here, but this can be sexism, sizeism, ableism, any kind of implicit bias out there. All right. So in medicine, we realize this. We realize that we were doing some harm, that we really need to work on how do we dismantle health disparities and how do we close the gap. So we really started out trying to really focus on cultural competency. So that's me learning about my patient, and that's going to help me provide the best care possible. But what we learned is that really, it's not a checkbox, and culture we know is not static. And it's also put the power back in my hands, right? I'm the expert, you're not. This is how it's going to be. So we realized that was a no-go. So we moved on to cultural humility, which is basically, you're the expert, I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to learn from you. And it's a lifelong process, but it's not enough to dismantle the health inequities out there. So this is pretty much where we are right now. We're in a period of self-reflection, and this is where biases come in. And we're asking ourselves, well, what do we bring to the table, right? I know about you, but what am I bringing to the table as a provider? And what this allows us to do is actually create a culture of safety, which is what you want. Yeah. So we know that implicit biases are the invisible influences on our clinical judgment. They're not unintended, they are unintended, and they're often unacknowledged. And they tend to creep in when things just aren't quite ideal. And that's the world of medicine. Typically, you're under a lot of pressure, you are lacking time, you could be very uncertain about a patient or a diagnosis, or you could just be tired. And this is when bias tends to creep in. Our minds really like, we like shortcuts, we like efficiency, and we like things to be simple. And this is like the prime example, the prime time when you'll see yourself most vulnerable for biases. Now, as Brent said, we are very much social by nature, so clinical decision-making is the same thing. What I am thinking, my differential diagnosis is very much dependent on politics, very much dependent on what the nurses are saying over here, very much dependent on my cohorts and what they look like. So we're very much social by human nature. And then often in medicine, what will happen is that we tend to focus on outcomes like, did the patient get an infection while they were in the hospital? Did they get the right medication? But it's very seldom that we actually look at some outcomes and try to correlate it to any biases. Now, it's very hard to do and it takes time, I will say that, but we don't do a great job at that, just saying. And then in medicine, historically, when you look into, you go to a medicine lecture hall, we've been taught to think about things at a group level, like these are population risk factors. It's not until recently, like in the early 2000s here, that we started looking at algorithms and saying, hey, why does it matter if a patient is white or Black? And why should that determine the differences in their kidney function? So medicine is just now starting to catch up. So I love this diagram. This is taken from Tversky and Kahneman. There's two psychologists from the 70s. This is when their work really started, looking at the cognitive reasoning pathway. So there's basically two different systems going on. You have type 1, which is very automatic, it's very emotional, it's quick. Then you have type 2, and you're hoping that type 2 is going to balance out type 1, but it doesn't always. Type 2 is very slow, very rational, more reasoning involved. Bias tends to come in type 1, very fast, automatic associations, I'm going to prove. Type 2 is prone to biases too, but not as much as type 1. But I think it's just very, and there's different parts of the brain. So just for those of you who care, your frontal cortex is type 1 and type 2, and then your limbic system, amygdala is type 1. So different parts of the brains are activated. So thank you. And then, so how would bias show up today? So I am a pediatrician. I am working in the ER, and I consciously hold an association or a thought or feeling towards a certain group. I am called down to the ER to see a patient or a member from that group. What you might see from Dr. Cook is instead of me being close to that patient, I may be kind of standoffish. Instead of me giving you great eye contact, I may have poor eye contact. I may have a closed posture. I could be very nervous and blinking. You may compare that visit to the patient next door and say, well, Dr. Cook, and she's been in that other room a long time compared to, room 2. How that patient is going to feel, they're going to feel maybe dismissed, unheard, and they're going to probably feel unsafe, and they probably won't want to see me again. Of note, I think this is interesting. This is kind of where the ethical point comes in. As a provider, my level of implicit bias is the same as the general population. All of us, the data has shown, we're typically moderate to high with our implicit, and thank God we're pretty much low with our explicit bias. But as a provider, if I've taken the oath to do no harm, to help, no matter what you look like, and to provide just care to every room, what does that mean to me, and what is my duty? So this is how biases really affect health disparities. So I call it the care and connection pathway. So two things can happen. So Dr. Cook has this bias against a certain group. One, that bias could lead into differential care. My therapeutic plan is completely different. I am undertreating your pain. I am misdiagnosing you, or I'm completely following not the standard of care. That's going to lead to disparities in health. The second part is that kind of communication and care piece, right? So connection. So I talked about the verbal cues and the nonverbal cues. So that patient probably won't follow my advice. They may never come back to PenMed or wherever they're going again. They're not going to trust me, and they may never seek care anywhere else again. And that leads to disparities in health. So you got two systems kind of going together. either one or both of those systems can be activated. Now, I want you to keep this in mind. When we think about unconscious bias and stereotypes, that's typically against the most vulnerable groups already. Those groups already are coming in behind the 8 ball, and those groups are the ones typically experiencing those negative stereotypes. So it's kind of a double whammy. And then data has already shown that we've seen differences in males and females between who gets referred for different procedures. Studies have shown that there's patients, if you're Black versus being the other group, are you getting adequate pain? And there's also been studies in regards to like if you have a stroke, who's getting referral for thrombolysis, and the data has shown that this does exist. All right, so I feel like implicit bias is kind of like abstract to some people, and like it may exist, but does it really matter? And like, what does the data show? So I wanted to provide you all with 2 systematic reviews because the data is real. There's correlation and there's causation. This is not something that's made up. Paupers came out with a great systematic, well-known review, and they looked at cognitive biases in general and how they affected management decisions. And then Hall and her group, they looked specifically at racial ethnic bias and how it affected patient-provider interactions as well as a treatment decision. So the data is out there. You have to be willing to look it up. All right, so I loved this slide. So we are in medicine making some progress, and I do find hope in that. I'm definitely seeing a shift in the culture from me being a medical student to a resident to now as an attending. So we realize that our verbal cues, it matters, but what matters also is how we talk to each other from provider to provider, the language we use, and Goodall and her group, and they were out of, I would say, Oregon, alma mater, UFC, and then Hopkins. They did this study where basically they looked at the written record, and they had medical students and residents. They looked at the written record where it was stigmatizing language being used, and they also looked at the records where there was neutral language being used. And it made a difference in patient-centered care. There was less variation in treatment decisions, and they actually had more positive perceptions of their patients. So mind you, if you have both of those things coming into a room, what that does to outcomes. I advise you guys to all look up this paper too. She's now Dr. Brooks, but she was a medical student at Brown when she wrote this paper. It's called A Silent Curriculum. And she talks about her years as a medical student and how she learned so much more from outside the classroom, from her attendings, from the nurses, from the techs, from the staff in regards to how to treat patients, by the language they use, their mannerisms and so on. So what we're doing in medicine, we're learning, it's not just the classroom, it's outside these walls and the everyday experience, and they're learning from us. Of note, a little bit of fact, the longer I practice in medicine, the data shows the more negative perception I have of my patients. So that just brings emphasis, that brings magnitude and emphasizes the structural deficits that are already in place. So the longer I practice medicine, the more negative attitudes I have towards my patients, and what does that do towards their care and biases that already exist. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of the implicit association test. Free, it's been around since the 90s. It's really a quick one-line tool to really, the goal is to really bypass your conscious processes to reveal your implicit biases. I love the fact that now in medicine, we've been using the IET as a method to really increase diversity. So Dr. Paupers, who is at Ohio State, he's done a ton of research on this. So he's used the IET for awareness with the admissions committee and had them take the test, look at the results, internalize it, and he's seen differences in regards to what the representation looks like when they're doing the next cohorts of classes. So if medicine can start to do this, why isn't law doing this? Why isn't education doing it? The first step is awareness. Okay. Now, it's not a perfect test. It is. Nothing in life is perfect, but some of the drawbacks is that you can't have some variability over time. So if Dr. Cook were to take it today at 10 p.m., I might get one result, and if I take it again at midnight, I might get another result. So it makes it very limiting as far as reproducibility and long-term tracking, but it's a start. I love this. So this is probably one of the best things that everyone in this room can do. If we can just take some time to be empathetic and just pause and do some perspective taking before your encounters, during your encounters, and after your encounters, I think you all make this world a better place. I do this a lot at the bedside. So what you want to do is really try to see the world through your neighbor's eyes, your patient's eyes, your classmates' eyes. What was life like for them to get to the ER? What is life going to be like once they leave? It's taking a moment to empathize, and empathy has been shown to be correlated with increased patient outcomes and less bias. Now, our friends at Thomas Jefferson came out with this wonderful tool. You do have to pay for it, it's not free. But it's the Jefferson Scale of Empathy. And the goal of this tool is really to measure clinical empathy. Does a patient, does a provider have the ability to understand a patient's feelings? Not feel what they feel, but understand it. To make a plan to be intentional and be objective, increase their outcomes, and also not burn out. It's a wonderful tool. It's translated in over 50 languages. It's been used in like over 80 countries. But it's a goal, and it's a tool, and it's a step, and I encourage you guys to check it out. Yeah. Other things that we can be doing in our personal lives, we can be sharing these tips with our colleagues and friends. I'm going to start with common identity formation because I do use this one a lot, and I do talk about this a lot within our hospital and our lectures. Data has shown that we like our group. It's just the way we are, right? So if someone can be put into our in-group, the chances that I'm going to maybe treat them more favorably or show less bias is greater. So what that means for Dr. Cook would be, if I have a patient and they're in the ER or they're on the floor, trying to find a connection. When you leave the hospital, when I discharge you tomorrow, like, what is the first place that you're going to go to? What's your favorite food? Where did you grow up with? Are you a Phillies fan? I'm not. Like, so trying to make a connection. I'm not. I'm from Northern New Jersey. But trying to make a connection, and the data has shown that it works. And I use this quite a bit. And I like considering the opposite. So, and this is something that we need to be doing every day. These are small things that we can do. Accountability, people. What are you doing to counter the stereotype? What type of art is in your office? What type of art is in the hospital? What type of books are you reading? Are you volunteering and working with different people? You need perspectives and you need experiences and narratives to shift that so that your brain doesn't automatically go somewhere where it shouldn't. I was watching a webinar and they describe bias as this. So if you're walking like on campus at a college, you have your path, right? That your normal path that everyone's walking. And then you see that kind of like dirt road, like that dirt path that somebody just kind of, that shortcut. That's the bias that we don't want to enter. So if we can try to do some of these things, it may alleviate us, leave it as trying to form a shortcut. And I think that, I know that this one works, the middle one, and I'm a big fan of this one. Individuating, I think that, at least for me on the floor, it's something that you want to say that you actively do and you hope you're doing. I really feel like it's really hard for me to pull up out of my pocket. I feel like I should be doing it every single day. But I know if I pause and say, Tiffany, let's try to form a partnership. Let's try to counter the stereotype. Those are kind of more objective in my opinion. Next. I think you might have skipped one. Yeah, here we go. So this is something else you want to think about. Does your organization, does your hospital, or just system have an upstander training or allyship training? At Penn Med CCH, we're in the process of actually developing a curriculum right now. I've seen this work. This is basically giving your employees, your colleagues, the skills to really interrupt bias in the real time. By doing this, you're actually changing the culture. You're showing solidarity, and you're saying, like, tell people it's not all on you to do it. You don't have to be the representative to do it. We all can take action. And this is important. And I was going to say this because implicit bias doesn't only affect our patients, but it affects us, all of us. We're in the system together, right? We have different backgrounds, different lived experiences. So for me showing up and standing in and confronting bias, that's me standing up for not only a patient, but maybe my colleague too. It definitely creates psychological safety, and it actually allows a state of normalcy. When we start to acknowledge bias in real time, it kind of makes it like, this is normal. Nothing to be afraid of, but let's address it. And I think you might have mentioned a question to Brent earlier. I think one of the things we need to do is start normalizing things. Normalize these conversations like, hey, why did you say that? Ouch, that hurt. Not okay. Well, why did you say that? It's okay that you said it. I want you to feel safe, but let's figure out like why it wasn't okay to say that. All right. And then I love this paper by Gonzalez. This gave me hope. So she did a paper with her group, and they basically did a focus group with Black and Latino patients, centering on their clinical experiences with bias. And they were both English speaking and Spanish speaking. And they talked about their implicit bias experiences. But the next question was, well, where do we go from here? And this really restored trust for me. And this made me feel like the connections weren't severed and we could create new pathways. The patients basically said, listen, if you acknowledge the incident in real time, be sincere and apologize, it can be almost equivalent as if that event never happened. So I showed you that pathway with health equity and outcomes. Imagine how much of this could be mitigated if we had the skills that we needed to feel comfortable to do it in a safe way in real time. So when I read this paper and I was doing research, it just really made me hopeful, and it restored some trust that we're not doomed. And then I'm gonna end with this slide. So Dr. Kamara Jones, if you don't know her, please look her up. She has different allegories, and I got this figure from Belez and her group with their paper, and that focus on implicit and explicit bias. And basically, this is kind of where we are. Right now, our soil and foundation of medicine is a little bit tainted. We know we have a history of racialized medicine. Our applicant pool, the doctors we had, there's not as diverse as it should be compared to the population. We're under considerable amounts of cognitive load, less resources. And then depending where you are, there could be a biased environment. That's just the soil. It is what it is. Those are the facts. We're hoping that we get to the situation where we're in towards the right, where we're having stakeholders in the medical field, such as myself, other leaders, go into these spaces so that people in under-resourced areas can have safe housing, low crime, healthy foods, quality education. So we're giving them the best possibility ever to make the best choices and have the best outcomes. And so when I see them with my biases that are already in me, I'm starting to transform. Even though I have this soil and I'm been planted in this environment, I'm starting to transform and say, hey, this is possible. Versus kind of having people set up in these under-resourced communities where there is no choice for opportunity to succeed. And all you're seeing is poor outcomes. It's just reinforced on top of really, really bad soil. So I'm hoping that we continue to strive and move this way. It is going to be a collaborative effort. I don't believe there's any like walls with medicine. I think medicine is talking to transportation. Medicine is me talking to faith leaders. Medicine is me working out and going to areas where there's food insecurity. Medicine is all of that. And until we do that, the disparities and biases will continue to exist, and this is what you see. So we have to change that. We'll move on. No, I have a proposal slide. I think you said cool. All right. So awareness alone doesn't change outcomes. Practice and systems do. Inequities are often created not by overt mistreatment, but an even investment. Bias doesn't exist alone in isolation within individuals. It's shaped by systems. Other factors like high workload, decreased time and pressure, reinforce inequities. Many bias reduction strategies today rely on short-term pre and post, no real-time tracking. We have to prove that. And the question is no longer whether bias exists in medicine, but whether systems, policies, and procedures allow clinicians to time and resources to support in ways that align with their values. And bias today really looks like it did historically, but its impact can be just as real. The work ahead isn't about intent, it's about design.
Stay there for a minute and answer a few questions, or you want to see them?
I stand.
Okay. So we'll do the same thing that we did before and take some audience questions, and then we'll go to our panel questions. So yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna yell really loud to my backs to these people. Sorry about that. So we really hit an interesting point for me that may be a pull and a tug for an ER doc versus, say, a primary care physician.
Mm-hmm.
And that the more time you see something, the more bias you get. Now, some of that is good in that I recognize that symptom, I recognize something, and I can make a decision really fast. On the other hand, sometimes decisions are made too fast. And I don't know how you as an ER doc kind of balance that.
Yeah, so I think there's one thing to notice trends and patterns, but you can't just go to faulty association. So it's one thing for me to say, right now we're in the midst of flu season, right? All we're seeing is flu. I'm seeing tons of flu. So they call me to the ER to see a 10-year-old, and I go down and she's like, kid has fever, headache. It's one thing in my back of my brain to say, hey, well, you know what, this is likely flu. It's another thing for me to completely knock everything off of my differential. So it's one thing to say, hey, these are the trends of what I'm seeing, likely, possibly, and to do your management based on that. But it's one thing to kind of say, to destroy your differential completely based off of something else. So does that make sense?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
we have another question here? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I'm going to, thank you for bringing up the Harvard implicit bias test. I teach that. And I also teach, social journalism health with our physical therapists, I'm a physical therapist.
Okay.
So I just want to say that the implicit bias tests are available for everyone. And if we were talking about how do we get to the next place, I do have a question. How do we get to the next place? All of us need to take these tests. Every time I teach, I take another test and it highlights where I have biases, and then I can work on that. But my question is, if you are in an environment, especially when you're talking about scientists and doctors and hospitals, and what we do is with our patients is we take everything away from them. We take their clothes away, we give them a gown, we give them oxygen. And if they are suffering from some sort of implicit bias from their team, how do we address that? If it's the patient who notices it, or it's the family who notices it, because when we see families come up and they're irate, somebody has said something that's wrong to their family member who cannot fight for themselves or shouldn't have to fight for themselves. Is there something that can be done more effectively than me, the physical therapist comes in and says, hey, I'll talk to the doctor?
Yeah, I think that's where your cohort and your tribe comes in too, right? So like, you're only as good as your team. So when I take care of a patient in the ER or the floor or urgent care, I do all those things. I'm the provider, but I also have, there's usually a nurse, there's usually a front desk clerk, there might be a phlebotomist. I think that's where I was talking about that kind of like upstander and allyship. So if I am not being at my best and showing up at my best, it's up to someone to say, Tiff, like, I kind of heard that conversation. I looked at sort of patient's face. Maybe you need to take a breather because this is kind of how I read the room. So I think that's where your team comes in and you hold each other accountable. It's the same thing that, let's say I'll sign out patients with my providers, and we do it all the time, right? And they question you on something like their management decision. Well, Tiff, why did you choose that antibiotic versus this? Or can you tell me why we decided to do that? It's the exact same thing. And I think that's where kind of creating that safe space to do that. And that's where the structure comes in, the structure and system, making it okay to speak up, making it okay because we should be looking out for the patient. It's not really, the ownership is not really on the patient because it's such a power differential. If they are able to do it, that's fine. But if there's such a power differential and differential as far as privilege there, that it really makes it unbalanced and it makes it uneven. It's gonna be very seldom that you're gonna find a patient that feels that they have that courage, especially when they're vulnerable, right? You're taking care of me. I think that's when your cohort really comes in. That's where that checks and balances.
And that takes effort to create the culture.
It does. It takes time, it takes effort, and you have to feel safe doing it. That's where the whole it has to be a system buy-in from the top to the bottom in regards to implementing it, recognizing it and doing something about it, actionable steps.
Let's get do we have a question on that?
Yep, we have a question. Kendra asked, Dr. Cook, do you feel these mitigation strategies / practices are effective outside of the medical environment?
I do. I think that just an everyday, so other than being like a provider, I'm still a person. So I'm still a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a neighbor, I'm a friend. So in everyday life, as far as conflicts, I think just having a little bit of empathy and just pausing for a little bit, say, I wonder why that person showed up that way. I wonder why they answered the phone that way. I think it just kind of gives the situation and that person a little bit of dignity and respect. So I think that just finding common ground in a lot of things makes us closer, and using empathy and perspective taking also can help in a lot of situations, especially during conflict. Whether that's in the committee, whether that is outside, whether that's personal.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to invite both of you to come on up. Carefully, have a seat.
Yes.
There's many tripping hazards. Thanks. Okay, I'm gonna put this here, see if it works. If I need to move the microphone around, Jen, just let me know. All right, so we have some questions for our panelists, and I want to start with Dr. Ruswick. What might be some unconscious biases that still linger collectively from eugenics today?
Oh, this is how I conclude that class with students and trying to go through some of them. I'd start with the idea that worthiness as a human or as a citizen is linked to economic productivity. We tend, a lot of the eugenics movement was discussed at a group of Americans that, from a eugenicist perspective, could not carry their share of the economic load, or not being productively disciplined into a industrializing economy. And I think it's fair to say that we still evaluate people's worthiness, their eligibility for rights recognition, based upon how much labor they can perform, how much economic gain they can have. So I'd probably start with that. I think that many of us, maybe all of us, have at some point had the thought that it's the wrong sorts of people that are having all the kids, in America. And I'm not going to mimic the sort of racist version of that attitude, but the version that tends to come from the political left is well, it's the less educated, and it's from the religiously devout and so forth. Why aren't our kind having all the kids? So those are probably the two top. The third, which we see a lot in the news these days, is the idea that you can, and I think it relates to differences in testing between the afternoon and midnight, that you can reduce a person's worth to their intelligence, which you can measure with one test with one number on it, and that's all that you need to know about a person. And hopefully we all see the limits in that sort of logic. So
Thank you. Dr. Cook, something, and you spoke to this a little bit, but let's see if there's more here. Something that stood out in your presentation was empathy as an antidote to bias. And you talked about how it is important that you can do this in your everyday life. Can you give us a few examples so that those of us who are not in the medical field might be able to apply?
You want me to do a non-medical, like an everyday example, or okay, yeah. So sure. Let's say I'm a head of a committee, and let's say we're having our leadership meeting, and someone brings the notion to the floor, a solution or proposal as far as a next target area or strategy. Let's say I'm not in agreement with that. For some reason, we just don't see eye to eye. Perspective taken would be saying, let me just pause for a little bit, kind of see if I can figure out exactly where they're coming from, their family review, their lived experience, and so on. That's if they're coming in and it's been a pleasant conversation, right? It's a pleasant dialogue. B is we're in the same meeting in this real world, and we have different ideas, and maybe that person came in the room and she was very dismissive. He or she was dismissive or rude, or the tone was somewhat minimizing. And mind you, for me, I'm also a Black female too, right? So with that comes my own lived experiences and how you read things, right? How you internalize things. It's just a part of being human. So before I act on that, again, I would pause and say, well, maybe, what happened to, I'm going to use a Cassandra before she came into this room. I wonder what made her feel like this was the best strategy. And that's where curiosity comes, is peeling back the why. Why? It shows people that you're invested too. And again, it keeps that dignity in the room.
Love that. Thank you. So something we can all try. So this is a question for both of you. When did bias become an area of focus for you, and how in how you approach your work and science?
We were sort of talking about that before we began.
Yeah. So, because Liz, you asked, you said, when did you really start the health equity journey? And for me, health equity is just doing the right thing. Right now, it's termed health equity. It's this title or this word. But health equity truly is just showing up for everyone and giving everyone the same opportunity to thrive. That is my duty and my job as a provider and pediatrician, as a person. I would say, as far as bias, I noticed as a kid, and this has nothing to do with it, but I noticed as a kid, like my way of thinking probably was a little bit different than my parents. Our lived experiences were very different. My circle of classmates growing up was very different than theirs. My dad is no longer here, but he grew up very much in the South, and most of his life, Jim Crow. And I would notice like little things that would be said kind of here and there, like on our rides and things like that, and how my mind growing up was a little bit different because of my exposure. So I kind of was very like exposed to biases very early on. And it wasn't really until I would say probably about 5 years ago, it was because of my own biases. And this is how I really started working on biases. So about 5 years ago, I walked into a mom's room and she was African American. And this is again what you typically see. Typically, you do not see these disparities in Black females and Black families breastfeeding. So I remember I walked into the room maybe 7 years ago. I walked into the room, introduced myself, and the mom was by herself. In my mind, I assumed that she was not going to breastfeed. And she surprised me when she said, Dr. Cook, I am choosing to breastfeed. I really took the time at that point in time to really kind of uncover at that time, why did I think that? Like, and it was just one thing to see it, but why did I internalize that? And that's really kind of where I really got deep down into biases. So health equity is one thing, but truly biases and where they come from and how to not act on it, that was that starting point. And that's how I got really into my breastfeeding career, working on disparities in breastfeeding, becoming a breastfeeding counselor. So it's acknowledging that. And that's where the vulnerability comes in, right? It's acknowledging like, I felt a certain way. Why did I think that? And being able to look into it and hold it, be accountable for it and say, hey, this is what the world is showing me. How do I negate that? So that way I'm not putting my biases on my patients. So accountability, but that's how it started for me.
Love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ruswick.
As so engrossed, I think I forgot what I was going to say. But like we were saying, when we were chatting before, I mean, some of it's just, I mean, who I was, growing up, as well. I think I similarly had some tension in between my understanding of the world and that of, my parents, and trying to understand and resolve, where that came from. I similarly, just from an early age, had what I hope was a pretty pronounced sense of fairness and unfairness, and wanting to, promote the one and fix the other, where I could. I think I was always sort of drawn to that as academic topics. I always tried to pursue that in my teaching. One that comes to me off the top of my head is, I mentioned that, you sort of go wherever there's a job, in my line of work. And, so my first job was in rural Arkansas, at a place halfway between Toadsuck, Arkansas and Pickles Gap, Arkansas. And that required, no joke, you can look it up. But that required rewiring a lot of implicit biases and explicit biases that I had about rural Southerners. And, I mean, friends of mine who grew up in the South, who aspire like we do to, fight bias, will still go into sort of a Southern drawl when they want to mimic an uneducated, stupid person. And I think doing right by my students there, I think, sort of put me on the research and teaching path that I've been on since.
Love that. Thank you for those specific examples. Those are really helpful. I think when we hear where other people's stories, we can help to identify our own and maybe where our turning points are and what our opportunities are. Last question for both of you. If there's one thing that you hope folks walk away knowing about the bias in science based on our conversation this evening, what would it be?
So we go first. Either. Okay, cool. I think that there's hope. This is uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable is not considered a failure. But I just challenge each one of you to maybe challenge one assumption that's put out there. When you are in your realm, whether that is healthcare, education, law, whatever it may be, maybe make sure that, look and see, like, is everything that you're doing benefiting everyone? Like, who's missing from the table? I just want to encourage you to be brave, because there is hope. And the more we have these conversations, where we can be vulnerable and transparent and you can feel safe, that's where progress is made. So it's okay to be uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable is not a failure. But try one thing. Just be brave and try one thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also try to be a fan of ambiguity, and with that comes some unease. You have to learn how to be comfortable with that, unease. I mean, my study of the history of science and of bias is that, we on some level, do get to create our own worlds and our own realities, and that, we are, the building blocks, of whatever comes next, and we can bend it, toward the future. We can envision medical science and, physical science and social science, educational science that is based upon the values of inclusion and empathy and all that we've been trying to, promote here. It's doable. I wish I had more prescriptions on how, but I have to have the conviction it's doable.
Okay, sure.
The level of emergency, how does that impact lives, like in an emergency?
Yeah, for sure. So that's where that increased pressure and decreased time really sets in. So for sure, the less time you have and the higher the pressure, it's a segue for bias that people really want, and you have to be careful. Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me think about how you talked about your team and about how even more to have folks.
You have to rely on them, absolutely, because like, so if there's an emergency, someone comes in, like my assumptions may be, I'm using an example, these are not my assumptions. My assumptions might be, this is, I don't know, this is a homosexual male, and these are my top 3 differentials, we need to do this. I'm looking at Brent to come in, my colleague, and say, Dr. Cook, what about these things? Like, any other patient would be good considering this, why not this? So we're balancing each other out, we're still human. That's where your team comes in, because you can't do it all. We're work in progress. So that's where your team really comes in to hold you accountable. And if it's a safe team, like my team has no problem tapping me, I have no problem tapping them.
Love that, love that. So I want to honor time and wrap us up. I wanted to thank you both for your time and your sharing your expertise and your insight. One of the things that I really noticed from both of your conversations was a sense of hope. And it's one of the themes that in the conversations that we're having these days, how many people are saying to us, I'm really struggling, I'm feeling overwhelmed. So appreciate both the specific content and also the underlying message of we can make a difference, be brave, and have hope. So thank you for that.
Thank you all. Let me know.
I have research.